The briefing is brought to you in association with Spain. From the wilds of the Atlantic to the warmth of Mediterranean isles, the Spanish coast has something for every occasion. And whether chartering a yacht or renting a more modest motorboat, there's no better way to explore this magical country's lesser-known highlights than from the open water. Listen out for a new summer season of The Concierge on Monocle Radio. Join Robert Bound and friends as they turn navigator for an unforgettable journey along the Spanish coast. From hidden gems to legendary gastronomy, and with the unique drama of the America's Cup in the host city of Barcelona added to the mix, discover why the time is right to take to the waves. The Concierge, returning to Monocle Radio in July. This summer, set sail for Spain.
You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 2nd of August 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up on today's programme.
And in the face of that, you have this organisation that basically no one's ever heard of and no one's paid much attention to, which suddenly has a lot of influence over the future of our ecosystem and our oceans.
A little-known organisation is currently meeting in Kingston, the outcome of which could change the future of our planet. We'll be talking nuclear non-proliferation with Dr. Marion Messner. We'll be getting a roundup of Olympic architecture and design, and we'll be joining our colleagues in Paris, where we'll hear from the Executive Director of Impact and Legacy for Paris 2024.
But organising responsible games was very important for us, and that's why we work on that very hard for long years.
All that right here on The Briefing with me, Georgina Godwin. There is a leadership struggle underway. No, not that one or even that one. This is for the head of the International Seabed Authority, or ISA. The UN-associated group is holding the 29th Assembly in Kingston, Jamaica this week. And whoever emerges with the top job will potentially have the ability to influence the very future of our planet and indeed the entire human race. I'm joined now by the writer and broadcaster Ed Conway, who's the author of Material World, a substantial story of our past and future. Ed, many thanks for coming on the show. What is the ISA?
Well, this comes back to kind of like a bigger issue, which is that, you know, if we're going to get to net zero, achieve all of these big goals that we've set ourselves, have all of the wind turbines, the electric cars, all of this stuff that we need in the future, then we have to do an awful lot of mining. And the available stuff that we have to mine on the land, well, you know, we've kind of got a lot of the easy stuff. And there are big question marks over some of the metals. So, for instance, copper, we've been mining that for a while. It's in quite a few places, but we've mined a lot of the easy stuff. Cobalt, which you need, and by the way, you need a lot of copper to go into wind turbines, to go into solar panels, and basically everything like electric cars. If you're going to want like high performance batteries in electric cars, you need a lot of cobalt, you need a lot of nickel, you need a lot of manganese and a few other minerals. And the conditions in which we're mining this stuff on land are quite, you know, they're questionable. Most of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are terrible conditions in many of the mines there. And so a lot of people are thinking to themselves, okay, where do we get this stuff from if we can't get it on land? Could we get it from the sea? And it turns out actually underneath the ocean, there are lots of, well, they come in various different forms, but there's lots of minerals. Some of them are in the form of these little potato-sized nodules you find on the seabed. They contain loads of cobalt, loads of copper, loads of manganese, loads of nickel, basically exactly the stuff we need to make all those electric cars in the future. But here's the thing, that first of all, most of this stuff is in the high seas. Okay, so that's, you know, far from land. It doesn't belong to any particular country, and that's why there's this organisation, it's part of the UN actually, called the International Seabed Authority, whose job basically is to try to manage this process. Who really has the tenancy of these international waters? Well, it's the ISA. No one's ever heard of this place. I mean, I hadn't heard of it until I started researching this. But I'm either proud or ashamed to say that I'm one of the only people who's actually visited it. I went to their headquarters in Jamaica. It's this bizarre place. It feels like a kind of forgotten part of history, like a time capsule to the 1960s, basically entirely empty. It's been a kind of footnote in recent kind of economic history, but it's suddenly become really relevant because of this, because now people think that deep sea mining might actually happen and they want to carve it out, really. But that kind of brings me to like the second issue, which is there are massive ecological question marks over this. You know, the seabed is not a kind of inert thing. There are all sorts of ecosystems. We know so little about it, less about it than we do about the surface of Mars or the moon. And what we do know is that every time we've gone under the water, we have basically disturbed and in some cases degraded ecosystems that we just didn't even know existed beforehand. We're still discovering creatures we didn't know existed down there. So all of this is the kind of backdrop. And then the ISA is kind of meeting for its latest set of meetings. And right now they are trying to come up with the rules that will determine who can actually do this mining in the future.
And of course, there is this leadership struggle. Can you tell us about the completely opposite views of the two candidates?
Well, I mean, so essentially there's one side which is kind of very concerned about I suppose about the kind of environmental consequences. You've got essentially China is pushing very hard at the ISA to have as much dominance as it possibly can. It's putting more money than anyone else in. The US is just not really there. It's kind of this strange proxy thing because the US never actually signed up to the relevant UN treaty, so it doesn't actually have a place at the International Seabed Authority. And so you've got this strange kind of proxy battle. But ultimately, whatever these people decide is going to determine whether you can kind of send your diggers out to the seabed and do all this mining. And it's already, I mean, they're not mining yet, but they are already exploring. And the thing that makes this kind of different is that a few years ago, we just didn't have the wherewithal to be able to go down under the sea and do the mining. Today, you can, you have the autonomous vehicles that are capable of doing it. There's still a big question mark over whether it makes any commercial sense, but it is real. And for China, who, if they have an Achilles heel industrially, it's that they massively dominate battery manufacturing. So, the future of all these electric vehicles, a lot of that is going to be carved out in China right now. They massively dominate the kind of supply chains for the refined metals that go into those batteries, which is what kind of really matters because that's where a lot of the value is. But the bit they don't control is where the minerals come out of the ground. Okay, that China just doesn't have much lithium. It doesn't have any cobalt. It doesn't have any of the things you need to go in there. And so if they can get a stranglehold on this part of the mineral supply chain, then they think that then they have the entire supply chain sewn up, which is like a massive deal for Beijing.
So, of course, they are backing the Secretary-General, Michael Lodge, who wants to speed ahead with deep-sea mining. But the top UN marine scientist from Brazil, Leticia Carvalho, she believes that there should be a much more conservative approach before any mining can be allowed to begin. How does who wins this battle affect the future of our world?
Well, I mean, there's an initial kind of question, which is, who is going to have the kind of dominance of the leadership? And I mean, Michael Lodge has been the head of the ISA for quite a long time now. So he's actually a British guy who has plenty of allies there in Jamaica. I think there's the kind of subsequent question, which is that, right now they're at the stages of essentially pushing for getting the legal code kind of hammered out. So basically, once you have a legal code hammered out, then it means, you can actually start the proper exploration and you can start the proper mining. No one has as of yet actually started drilling underground or indeed kind of sucking up these nodules. But there are quite a few companies who are very keen to do it. One of them, the most famous one, is called the Metals Company. It used to be called Deep Green, run by a very interesting mercurial character called Gerard Barron. There's quite a lot of interesting characters involved in deep sea mining. What I would say is, if you look at the back history, a lot of those characters, so look at Gerard Barron's back history, a lot of them have been associated with episodes of companies basically going bust. So I think there is we might get to a point where in theory it is possible. In theory, you're allowed to mine the deep sea. But in practice, are loads of people going to do that because it's so expensive and it's quite kind of risky? That's I think, the question mark, if you're being really pragmatic about this. A lot of people within mining think that deep sea mining just won't happen, not because they can't do it, but because, basically most countries around the world, including the UK, will be so worried about the ecological consequences that they'll say no thanks. And that B, it will just be far cheaper to get stuff out of the ground, terrestrially anyway. The kind of counter argument to that is that, China, like I say, does that matter for China? For China, is the kind of the upside of being able to control all of the minerals enough of a compensation that you can pay whatever you want to get your kind of cobalt out of the ocean bed? Possibly, because having that security of supply is a big deal for China. And so it is the kind of one of the next fronts in this battle for the control of minerals around the world. But it's not the only one. Like a lot of people are trying to, China is trying to make inroads and has been for decades to African minerals as well. There are new discoveries of lithium all around the world at the moment. So there are lots of other places that this is happening. But what's kind of tangible is that there's a lot of money chasing quite finite supply of different minerals that we need if we're going to get to net zero. And some of that money is definitely looking at trying to get it from under the water. And in the face of that, you have this organization that basically no one's ever heard of and no one's paid much attention to, and is just sat in this kind of time capsule in Kingston in Jamaica for a long time, which suddenly has a lot of influence over the future of our ecosystem and our oceans.
Ed, thank you so much. That's Ed Conway there. Now, let's see what else we're keeping an eye on. Here's our Henry Rees Sheridan.
Thanks, Georgina. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said there is overwhelming evidence Venezuela's opposition won the recent presidential election. Blinken said it was clear opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez had won the most votes, despite incumbent President Nicolas Maduro declaring a disputed victory. The presidents of Brazil, Mexico and Colombia have all called on Venezuela to release the full details of last Sunday's election. The US and Russia have completed the biggest prisoner swap since the Cold War. The deal frees 24 detainees from 7 countries. The swap had taken more than 18 months to organise and is believed to have hinged on Moscow's demand for the return of hitman Vadim Krasikov, who was serving a life sentence in Germany. An Australian government review has found that serious failures by the Israeli military led to drone strikes on an aid convoy that killed 7 workers in Gaza. The strike on the 1st of April killed charity workers from the World Central Kitchen, including nationals from Australia, Canada, Poland, the UK and the US, as well as their Palestinian colleague. The review concluded that the Israel Defense Forces failed to follow procedures and made identification and decision-making errors. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Henry. You're back with a briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, the second session of the preparatory for the 2026 review conference of the parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT, has just concluded in Geneva. Dr. Marion Messmer, who's a senior research fellow in international security at Chatham House, has just returned from the event and joins me now. Marion, many thanks for coming on the show again. What was the purpose of this meeting?
The purpose of the meeting was to begin to align the states for the big review conference, which is going to take place in 2026. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty is essentially one of the oldest nuclear bargains we have, which sets out the 5 nuclear weapon states under the treaty and all the other states that are part of the treaty which don't have nuclear weapons. And the big goal essentially is to make sure that the number of states with nuclear weapons stays as small as possible. But the other important part of the treaty is also that that number is meant to reduce further over time. So all the 5 states with nuclear weapons agreed to disarm over time. So one of the big tensions in the treaty over the last few years has been that because the security environment has changed so dramatically in the last 2 decades, the 5 states that do have nuclear weapons haven't really made any progress on their disarmament. So tensions in that treaty are unfortunately also increasing.
Tensions particularly around Russia, China and Iran.
Yes, that's right. So what we had seen in the past was that Russia was actually, on the side of the other nuclear weapon states, essentially trying to prevent Iran from developing its own nuclear weapons program. But since Russia has found itself increasingly isolated in the international system after its decision to invade Ukraine in 2022, it also has redefined its relationship with Iran, which means that it now is no longer trying to help prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, which means that while we haven't seen it yet, it could be that this actually helps Iran from also getting nuclear weapons, which would be hugely destabilizing for the Middle East and beyond.
Well, in the context of Iran, did Gaza come up?
It did, yes. I mean, unfortunately, there are so many international issues at the moment, and the NPT has 191 states who are members, who are parties to the treaty, and so that means that among those 191, they really don't see eye to eye on all of these different sources of tension. So some states did essentially describe what's happening in Gaza as a genocide. And even though Israel isn't a party to the treaty, the US delegation ended up walking out of the room, sort of, in I guess, defense of their ally. And so this was one of the areas that states parties couldn't really agree on.
I wonder if it's fair to say that all-out conflict in the Middle East can only be contained at the low level of tit-for-tat action as long as Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. Earlier today on The Globalist, one of our analysts suggested that it may be a matter of just a few months until Iran does have such a weapon. What's your take?
I think you're right that it would become so much more dangerous if Iran was to have nuclear weapons. I mean, for lots of reasons, right? Like one of them obviously being that Iran would have nuclear weapons and they could do with them whatever they want. But the other also being that the Israeli government has made several comments over the years that they would absolutely go to war with Iran to try and prevent Iran from actually acquiring nuclear weapons. So if Iran's breakout time for achieving its nuclear weapons program was to reduce even further, then we could be looking at war between Israel and Iran, because Israel sees it as a matter for its own survival to ensure that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. And of course, if Iran was to acquire nuclear weapons, then Saudi Arabia probably would be trying to do the same. So then you're all of a sudden in this situation where more and more states are trying to acquire these weapons that have incredibly destructive capabilities, and once you then get to an escalation of conflict, once these states go to war with one another, there isn't really anything to say that the war would stay at the conventional level. It could escalate to nuclear, which is obviously a situation that would be horrendous and that we need to make sure we avoid at all costs.
So how far ahead with their plans are these so-called bad actors in what appears to be a renewed arms race?
Well, the problem is that the arms race isn't just looking at bad actors. I mean, the arms race also encompasses the US, it also encompasses France, it also encompasses the UK, because it's essentially this security spiral that you get into. And we're really seeing this and have been seeing this for the last few years, where nuclear modernization programs are accelerating. The US and Russia are investing heavily in new systems. Like France is reviewing the types of nuclear systems it has and whether they are sufficient for the country. So, this is unfortunately something that has already begun, and I worry will only accelerate with time as global tensions remain what they are, actually become worse.
As you said, this is all in preparation for the renewal meeting in 2026. Do you think that there are likely to be big changes when it comes to the treaty at that time?
So my big worry is that we can't safeguard the treaty as it is. So because the treaty fulfills such an important function in making sure that so many states can get access to nuclear technologies that they otherwise wouldn't have access to, things like nuclear medicine, which is things like X-rays or radiotherapy or lots of other things, and of course nuclear energy, and then on the other hand, of course, it also makes sure that nuclear weapons don't proliferate more, which is so important. And what Chatham House and lots of other actors, state and non-state actors alike, have been trying to do over the last few years is making sure that the treaty stays intact for a time when relationships between states are better again, and the nuclear weapon states can make progress on disarmament again. But all of these little political skirmishes make it such that, tensions between the states parties continue to increase. And there are states that are trying really hard to find areas of mutual interest and find areas where you could make progress. Nuclear risk reduction has emerged as one such agenda, because the idea behind it is that, no one wants conflict to go nuclear. So you try to focus on actions that could reduce the risk of nuclear war. But one of my big worries is whether the treaty can actually withstand all of the little political disagreements and all of these sort of instances of people disagreeing quite firmly with each other that sort of build up over time.
Marion, it wasn't all doom and gloom. You had a go at the nuclear negotiator game.
Yeah, that's right. So this is something that has come up out of one of our projects at Chatham House that we're really proud of. So the nuclear negotiator game is essentially a browser game where the player gets to have a go as a negotiator of a nuclear arms control treaty. And the game really distills the last 5 years of research where we've looked at complexity in nuclear decision-making, where we've looked at the sort of human factor and how people make decisions. And we're trying to really get across to the player all of these different push and pull factors, all of the things that make a negotiation really complicated. And if you're in the shoes of the negotiator, you have to make some really tough choices. And it's not always clear that any of these choices are going to be straightforwardly positive. So we were really happy to be able to showcase this at the conference, and also to have some real life, diplomats and negotiators play as our fictional negotiator and give it a go.
Marion, thank you very much indeed. That's Dr. Marion Messmer. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. It is 13:20 in Paris, 12:20 here in London. As the Games are in full swing, it's only fitting we get an Olympic arts and culture roundup. And I'm joined now by Tim Abrahams, who's contributing editor to the Architectural Record. Tim, you actually wrote the Paris guide to the Olympics for The Telegraph. Tell us more about that.
I was fortunate enough to go to Paris, always a pleasure, although bittersweet in my case because I was writing about the Olympics back in May now, with the knowledge that I wouldn't be able to go to it, but also be able to see what facilities were being put on offer and get very excited about the event, because I think the Parisians have put on an incredible show, and a very clever one too.
I mean, this guide is really in depth. I've been having a look through it, and it's everything from where to get your tickets to where to eat, and of course all of the venues too.
Indeed, the venues are an interesting one, because this is, as you possibly have heard, there is only one new venue that has been built for these Olympics. That's the aquatic centre in Saint-Denis, where the swimming isn't even taking place. This is where the diving is taking place, and so there is a sense that the Parisians have realised that this is their third Olympics. They have everything they need, all the facilities. They only need it topping up in this capacity. And what they're doing is using the Olympics to reinvent, rethink, and redisplay themselves to the world. So you have the incredible situation where you have the Grand Palais, which is being in the process of being refurbished by Châtillon Architects, which has been given over to hosting the fencing and the taekwondo halfway through the process of the Grand Palais being reinvented, and giving this landmark structure a kind of key role at the centre of the event when it otherwise might have been ignored due to the refurbishment.
I understand you also went to the Athletes' Village. Now, there's been a lot of controversy about that. Tell us more.
The reason why there's been controversy is people fear that it might be... that it might produce a situation where you, in an area where housing is needed by the local people, and there's an incredibly large number of flats on offer, 6,000 residents are being offered spaces here, that you then draw in people from outside, and the locals don't necessarily benefit. I think there is clearly an issue there. That's not necessarily one that the designers themselves can solve. It's more of a wider social issue. But the work there, Dominique Perrault, famous French architects, master planned it and given out the work to lots of talented young architects, including Gonzalez and Associates, one of my favourite French practices. And the the atmosphere that it's engendered, the place that it's created in an unprepossessing industrial site on the Ile Saint-Denis, it's really remarkable. They've taken most advantage of this part of the river. There's a large bluff. There's a site above the river looking down on the Seine, and it's quite a piece of work. Who will benefit from that is something for Paris to sort out itself after the Games.
Now, when I've been watching at medal ceremonies, I've been really struck by the fact that it gets slightly awkward because they're given the medal and then they're also given this box which they've got to hang on to whilst they're posing for photographs and all the rest of it. What's in the box?
What's in the box? A question that any Olympic geek like myself was immediately asking. It turns out it's quite an unusual thing that's been given to athletes. It's actually a poster designed by Ugo Gattoni, an artist, and it's effectively a kind of fantastical view of Paris. I think a kind of surrealist fantasy. It taps into the kind of surrealist tradition that the French and the Parisians are known for. And the poster kind of compresses the whole of the city into one view, turning it into a kind of party venue or a sports venue. And each poster, I believe if you're gold, there's gold tracing, and if you get silver, there's some silver tracing in it as well. But you have this incredible poster which will dominate the apartments and houses of whoever puts it up. It's really striking, very colourful and very celebratory. I would like one, but I'm not going to get one.
How does that poster and that look play into the sort of design overlay, the overall look of the Games?
Well, because of the way in which the Games has been hosted, in the fact that there is only one new venue, it means that there's a lot of existing venues. There's the La Défense Arena for the swimming. There's the Taekwondo and being held in the Grand Palais. There's underneath the Eiffel Tower is the beach volleyball. It means that the overlay, the posters, the banners, and the drapery that needs to be installed has an even greater role to play, and it has to communicate something about the city. And it's an issue that came up in 1984 in Los Angeles, which was another Games where not many new buildings were built for the sake of the Olympics. And what has been done by Joachim Ronsin, the head of design for Paris 2024, is to pick up some of the ideas that the designer of 1984's Games, Deborah Sussman, did, and that's to create a palette of colours and shapes which express something more about the city than straight emblematic representation. Like when Sussman took over in 84, it was all red, white and blue, stars and stripes, and she turned it into a kind of palette of saffrons and magentas and vermilions, and similar things being done by Ronsin, blues, reds, greens and purples with an arch as a motif, and they're very subtle, but you will have noticed them all across the different venues that you will have been watching. And when you're in Paris, as I believe, talking to friends who were there, this is the design aspect that people are most coming into contact with, these gorgeous colourful banners which try to communicate as something about Paris which is joyful rather than kind of the French tricolour, if you know what I mean.
I do. Tim, thanks very much indeed. That was Tim Abrams. Now, we've talked about the art and architecture of the Paris Olympics, but let's take a longer view now. Hosting a Games is expensive. Paris 2024's organising committee reportedly has had a total budget of close to €4.5 billion. And in an era of a cost of living crisis, every cent has to be justified, not just to the immediate residents of a city, but to those of the future. Luckily, the Olympic and Paralympic Games have become the setting of some long-term strategies. So earlier, on Monocle in Paris, Emma Nelson was joined by Marie Barsac, Executive Director of Impact and Legacy for Paris 2024.
How's it going? How's the Olympics going for you?
Fantastic. We are very happy to welcome the world and to showcase Paris and the Games. And we have a lot of medals, so...
I bet. I know. We know. Tell us, what events have you been to and what have you enjoyed the most so far?
On the ceremony, I think.
Oh, did you go?
Yeah.
Oh, where were you?
I went there in a boat. Near the Pont de l'Alma, near the Pont Alexandre III, on the Rosa Bonheur boat. But it was fantastic because it tells everything we wanted to address. Lots of messages about diversity, inclusion, universality, all those values that are very important for us. And we have been working on those subjects during many years now, and we were so proud to showcase all of this with the ceremony.
And you did very elegantly, and many thanks for that indeed. Now, let's talk about the legacy, well, the immediate benefits, because as I mentioned just then, you have the immediate impact, which the residents of a city must feel that they have something good and worthwhile happening in them. But then you also have to think about the longer term. And one of the big issues that always faces an Olympic Games is how do you encourage young people to feel as if they are part of that? I mean, arguably it's pretty good because an awful lot of the people who are competing are young, but they are already elite. And so if you're a sort of a 12, 13-year-old Parisian sort of sitting in front of your laptop going, okay, has that got anything to do to me? I mean, how do you make sure that you include and benefit young Parisians and indeed young French people?
Yes, you're right. It's one of our priority to encourage the youth to practice sports and to be more active. Our key was to anticipate a lot, and we launched programs very early in the project. That's what we learned from London, for example. And we, for example, had an emblematic measure, which is 30 minutes of physical activity every day at school. We launched an experimentation in 2020. We scale it with voluntary schools, 10,000 voluntary schools implemented that measure, and the government decided to generalize that. We needed that time, like 4 years to begin with an experimentation, to scale it to all over the country for the 36,000 schools in France. We are very proud of that because it's a massive impact for the health and the well-being of the generation 2024.
You'd see and feel that immediately, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and it's part of the strategy to have an impact before the beginning of the Games, to be sure that we have a positive impact for the population. We really wanted Games to connect to people, to benefit to them. Organizing spectacular games, it's the easy part, I can say, when you are in Paris and when we showcase all what we have in Paris. But organizing responsible games was very important for us, and that's why we work on that very hard for long years.
You're making quite difficult look easy is something that the Games are excelling at the moment. When we first started our conversation, and you talked about the boat and the fact that this is an inclusive Games. I mean, so much has been made about parity and the fact that we have the same number of sportsmen and women taking part. I mean, inclusivity is one of those big words that no one quite grasp. So what exactly do we mean about making the Games inclusive? I mean, how do we see that?
You can see that if you go to the Rosa Bonheur. There is a Pride House, which is the first official fan zone of the Games, open to the LGBT community and everyone, in fact, because it's, of course, inclusive. For us, it has been very important to have this official place to celebrate the Games with the LGBT plus community, and also have a legacy program around that, because there is works which is done and will continue after the Games to help the clubs to be more inclusive to the LGBT plus community, to welcome them better than it's the case today. So we are very proud of this project, and it's really part of our DNA and what we wanted to address. I think you saw that at the ceremony again.
How did you identify the priorities? I mean, you spoke about...
Well, we set up a committee in 2019. The committee was Gender Equality and Combating Discriminations. And there were experts in that committee, representative of all the communities, and they help us to find the good solution, what we should do. And one of the challenge was to be more open to the LGBT plus community in the clubs to practice sports. They don't have a lot of opportunities to practice sports in a good situation with a warm welcoming. So we worked on that with training programs, worked with the experts to progress in that aspect.
Finally, quick question. We're 10, 15 years away. We're 2034. And you're sitting back and you think, there's one thing that we did that really stayed. What would you like that to be?
I think more sport for kids, as you said at the beginning.
That was Marie Barsac, who's Executive Director of Impact and Legacy for Paris 2024. She was in conversation with our Emma Nelson earlier on Monocle in Paris. And do tune in this weekend at 10 a.m. Paris time, that's 9 a.m. here in London, for more great Olympics coverage, as only Monocle can do it. It's live from the City of Light. And every weekday at 9 a.m. CET, our brand new show, Monocle in Paris, broadcasts from the French capital until the end of the Games. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing, which was produced by Laura Kramer. Our researchers were Gunnar Grinlid and Sana Jamani, and our studio manager was Christy O'Grady. The Briefing is back on Monday at the same time. I'm Georgina Godwin. Goodbye and thanks for listening.